Kenny Lee once had to gather up his family and escape Vietnam. Now he has no problem bringing his family back. These days, Kenny and his wife Sandy call the Southland their home. And like many Vietnamese, they're returning to their former homeland for a visit. But what's different for the Lees is how much they have on the line here these days. They are far more.
And, you know, we very conservative, try to have some capital to start our business. And dream come true.
The dream has come true. Kenny and Sandy took that $60 and eventually built an LA clothing business that buzzes 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. If you wear stone-washed blue jeans, it's very possible you're wearing a product prepared at this plant. In the beginning, the Lees didn't really have a home. They moved every few months while Kenny first taught himself the trucking business and Sandy worked a sewing job.
I know, but you know...
Now the family home is a beautiful San Gabriel Valley estate where the children are never far. Daughter Lynn, the eldest, works with their parents in the family business.
It's always on my mind how brilliant they are. It's, you know, my father's always been able to see things ahead of time, see business opportunities ahead of time.
For their first 15 years here, the Lees stayed away from Vietnam. Those who had escaped were not welcome back. But when Vietnam began reopening in 1990, the Lees started returning to their old country for regular visits. Vietnam is doing what it can to bring in outside money and business. $1 billion has been pledged during the last year. The Lees' contribution is a small but very visible part of that, based on a very simple premise.
My country is a tropical country, so it's hot all year long, and a big opportunity for ice cream.
But it was all still a gamble. This is the first American fast food franchise in Vietnam. And just look at the menu board. All those zeros mean a scoop of ice cream can cost a good part of a day's wage for an average worker here. Despite the costs and the 2 years it took to set up, the crowds have kept coming. And now there are plans to open 2 more stores before the end of the year. Watching over the operation full-time is the Lee's Vietnam-born, American-raised son, Steve, who's getting his first real taste of life in Vietnam.
At first it's and it's been nice.
And Steve's parents? After leaving almost 20 years ago, now they seem to live somewhere in between. So where is home?
Both.
But, you know, especially when we come back to United States, you feel like very, very comfortable.
In fact, they're so comfortable in this country, it's made it possible for them to go back and help people in a country they thought at one time they would forever have to leave behind.
Fall of Saigon. It was sponsored by a Vietnamese group. Thousands of Vietnamese took to the streets of Ho Chi Minh City to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the end of the war. Tanks and a brigade of motorcycles were all part of today's festivities. Many Vietnamese hope this anniversary will mark a new understanding with the United States.
It is our stronger desire to see an early resumption of the full relations between the two countries. I think this is the aspirations of both peoples of our two countries.
Come back today. Certainly greeting you with open arms.
Later in the evening, the crowd
Today, the former U.S. Embassy sits empty, broken, silent. 20 years ago, it was the epicenter, the only place to be if you had sided with the Americans during all those years of the war. If you managed to find yourself inside these walls on the final days, you might get out of the country alive, but it was no guarantee. Up on the top floor of the embassy, a young CIA officer, Frank Snepp, was trying to get people out.
Well, you know, the way the war ended was the way we'd waged it, with a lot of wishful thinking. What that meant in the end was that there was no planning for an evacuation.
No evacuation plan was started or even written up because there was fear it would cause citywide panic. If there was a first priority, it was to move out remaining Americans, but beyond that, there really was no plan.
In many ways, the evacuation was an exercise, terrible to say, in racism. We saved the people in the white skin, but we left behind a lot of the people who were not white. Oh, we were very determined to make sure that no American was left behind. But we forgot a lot of Vietnamese who had come to depend on us.
As April 1975 had dragged to a close and troops from the north surrounded the city, the signal that the Americans were pulling out came during an English-language radio broadcast in Saigon. Just after high noon, an obviously out-of-season Bing Crosby song was played, and everyone knew crowds started massing at the embassy gates, begging to be allowed inside. Within hours, the embassy grounds were filled beyond capacity.
There was a Vietnamese outside my office who had a pig under her arm. She was going to take it out. Children were crying. We were moving down the hallways from time to time, trying to make sure the South Vietnamese had no arms, because had they decided to turn on us, had they thought we were going to leave them, they would have turned on us. So there was a great charade going on. Get them up to the roof so they can be taken off. Get them up fast so they won't turn on us.
Up to the roof was really the only way out. American helicopters were coming in every few minutes, carrying people out to ships which were waiting offshore. Down below, on the embassy grounds, there was a sea of humanity. The lucky ones, the people who'd been able to get inside the embassy walls. Again and again, this group was assured, don't worry, you won't be left behind. But even with flights every few minutes, the Americans weren't coming close to getting all their loyal Vietnamese comrades out.
We had agents trapped outside the embassy who couldn't get to us, and we couldn't get to them. And they were calling, and I'm Mr. Mao, the driver. I'm so-and-so. Please come rescue me. And you'd get on the radio and say, just stay there, we will try to rescue you. But you knew you were not going to be able to do it.
While Frank Snepp and the other CIA officers on the top floor of the embassy knew the end was near, one American on the outside was thinking just the opposite. Luke Fogarty had just purchased a home here in Saigon. He was planning to settle down. At the time, Fogarty was here working with big oil companies. They'd always had good information, until now.
I just didn't think anything was going to happen in Vietnam because Shell was drilling, Mobil was drilling, they found oil. I figured they know more than the CIA does, so we don't have to worry about it.
But then he heard White Christmas on the radio, and he knew he had to leave. He remembers the Vietnamese trust coming through in the final hours.
They have a very deep sense of dignity and decorum, I guess. They were not. I mean, none of them were panicking. They should have been panicking. We knew we were going to get out. We had no worries, but, I mean, they had to be worried.
After more than a day of waiting, Fogarty was airlifted to a U.S. aircraft carrier. For the Americans, the goal was to get out. For the troops from the north, this was their goal. The gate at the presidential palace, this was the very center of the opposition government. When all was said and done, it only took 10 minutes to take control of this spot. It was midday on April 30th when the first tank from the north crashed through the gates. In tank number 6 was a very excited 51-year-old colonel in the North Vietnamese Army, Tong Viet Dong.
We expected to take more time to seize Saigon because we expected more resistance. It was a surprise for us and our soldiers.
Of course, by the time the red flag was going up over the city, Frank Snepp and the other CIA officers over at the embassy had long ago headed to the roof themselves.
The Marine Guards took all my weapons, and they began pushing the Vietnamese out of the way. so the last of the CIA contingent could escape. And they pushed them hard. And as I made my way up this very narrow stairway, I couldn't look in their faces. They were being shoved aside to save those of us who had not bothered to save them.
When the final helicopter lifted off from the embassy roof, at least 400 people were still on the grounds below, still holding to the promise they wouldn't be left behind.
You see, for a lot of Americans, Vietnam had been like a B-52 strike from 60,000 feet. Oh, we knew we were in there punching away, but we very seldom saw the consequences of our actions. Let me tell you, that last day, we saw the consequences all right in the face. We were on the deck. We'd stared it in the face. And nobody was there would ever forget it.
Carrie Pfeffer, Channel 9. Today, the former U.S. Embassy sits empty, broken, silent. 20 years ago, it was the epicenter, the only place to be if you had sided with the Americans during all those years of the war. If you managed to find yourself inside these walls on the final days, you might get out of the country alive, but it was no guarantee. Up on the top floor of the embassy, a young CIA officer, Frank Snepp, was trying to get people out.
Well, you know, the way the war ended was the way we'd waged it, with a lot of wishful thinking. What that meant in the end was that there was no planning for an evacuation.
No evacuation plan was started or even written up because there was fear it would cause citywide panic. If there was a first priority, it was to move out remaining Americans, but beyond that, there really was no plan.
In many ways, the evacuation was an exercise, terrible to say, in racism. We saved the people in the white skin, but we left behind a lot of the people who were not white. Oh, we were very determined to make sure that no American was left behind. But we forgot a lot of Vietnamese who had come to depend on us.
As April 1975 had dragged to a close and troops from the north surrounded the city, the signal that the Americans were pulling out came during an English-language radio broadcast in Saigon. Just after high noon, an obviously out-of-season Bing Crosby song was played, and everyone knew